Very much indeed. The questions now we have. I'm sorry, this is a bit Wadham-dominated. Wadham undergraduates, turquoise, that's it, yes, there you are, with microphones. So if you'd like to ask a question, you put up a hand and one of them will reach you with the speed of light, and we'll get on with it. Is anybody going to open the batting?
One up there.
There?
Up in the gallery.
Up in the gallery, sorry, yes.
Thank you very much.
Can you just shout out? It makes it a lot easier. Just say, I'm up here, or something like that.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your very interesting talk. The title of the talk, The Invention of Modern Science, leads me to pose the question, why didn't it happen before? Certain utensils were invented in the early 17th century, such as the refracting telescope, so we're led to believe. Why wasn't such an instrument invented before? And there are many other questions one could pose as to why modern science, if you want to define that, didn't happen centuries before. Thank you.
Can we have a brisk reply, first of all, from you, Joe?
From me? Yeah, that's... I'm being put on the spot here. Yeah. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I'm not saying that other people don't, but I don't think I know the answer to the question. I mean, I think, you know, the cultural situation has to be correct for, you know, people to have the freedom and the imagination to develop things. And I'm guessing that at that time, the environment at that point was such that it was okay and permitted to do this. But I would prefer to pass this on to a colleague who may know better.
Marcus, then Paul.
Well, I think the interesting thing is, if you look at mathematics, it certainly was happening before that point. And maybe it is about the access to tools which allow you to start investigating more, because in mathematics the tool is this one here. So if you look at the centuries before Wilkins, certainly if you look east, you find algebra being developed in the House of Wisdom. You find new numbers being discovered in India, in China as well. New mathematics being developed. So it's interesting. I mean, from a mathematical point of view, I would say that there was a sort of critical mass and a story going on for centuries before the scientific story sort of started, as it were.
We tend to think of the 1660s as a sort of the invention of modern science and the scientific revolution, because, you know, it's good to talk about it like that. But just as Marcus said, there was science going on before. In the Middle Ages, we had another Bacon, Roger Bacon, here for a time, and there were real advances in the Middle Ages. We go to the Greeks, I mean, the classical time from Miletus through to Athens. So, and in fact, if we go back further, I mean, the truth is that the agricultural revolution and metallurgy and materials with Bronze Age and Iron Age all have their basis on scientific thinking. But there was a real flowering in the 17th century, and it had something to do with, I think, the mixing up of ideas that sort of exploded. So, of course, there was science before, but something quite special did happen, in my view. And I think it's something to do with the ideas rushing around, maybe even related to the Reformation in part, I think.
And would you like to develop that, or shall we move on?
I'd be interested to hear from a historical point of view what...
Well, all right. I think there was a very
good for you, Marcus.
I think there was as I said in the few remarks, that it had happened before in different places, and India, as Marcus mentioned, and Italy, and so on. But there seemed to have been a coherence and a collectivity at that particularly extraordinarily turbulent time in this country. I just skated over the turbulence. It was extraordinary. Deaths, revolution, changes, possibilities for social, all of that threw up this collective, not as a kibbutz collective, but a collective of men who, in many different directions, were going for the same thing based on the great ideas of Francis Bacon. But more important than anything else, they provided themselves with a platform. And the platform was the creation of the Royal Society. And from that platform, many people could come in and out through the transaction and develop from there. That might have been why some people say this was a big point and place in the development of what we call modern science. It doesn't exclude other things happening before at all. But I think something particular did happen then. Right, that's enough of me. Anybody else? Who wants to talk?
Up here.
Yes, right, there, just in front of you. Could you stand up and then we can have a bit of a chat? Thank you.
Would Wilkins be encouraged and optimistic about the scientific community's emerging response to the Ebola crisis?
Right, Wilkins and the Ebola crisis. That's a quick leap. Well, Paul, I think that's you, isn't it?
Would he have, what would he have done about the Ebola crisis? Well, you know, what do we do about the Ebola crisis is the first thing. I think the way we have to approach the Ebola crisis is in some ways rather similar to how Wilkins would have approached any problem in science. We have to observe properly, we have to look for the regularities, we have to produce ideas about how it would work, and then we have to use that knowledge to develop ways to manage it. It's just unfortunate that because it was seen as a fringe disease that the pharmaceutical industry hadn't invested in these sorts of studies to be able to combat it. And I think the lesson from it is that we need greater private-public partnerships to ensure that diseases that plague humankind, even if they may not lead to commercial advantage, will be supported and researched. So I think that's the main lesson for that.
Another question? There's a chap here at the front, if there's a mic on, and somebody there behind. If somebody, all right, somebody here, all right, and somebody, come on, just across
There
the
is
road
one up
here.
the top, actually.
Can you get a microphone up
Yeah,
to the
but-
very, very top
Is there a
eventually?
microphone at the top? Well, we'll start here and see if we can get a microphone up there.
Thank you. I was wondering what Wilkins would have thought of the World Wide Web. And
So I can't hear you. Yes.
sorry, I was wondering what Wilkins would have thought of the World Wide Web and how it brings scientists together, but also it seems to bring what you call the contrarians together to make false science communities around the world.
What would Wilkins have thought of the World Wide Web? Marcus?
Well, I think that's probably at the heart of why there was this revolution 400 years ago, is the ability to communicate and share ideas. So I think that's at the heart of how many of us do our research today, is that amazing connectivity. So I think he would have been extremely excited by the prospect, and certainly I don't think we could do our research in the same way that we do today without it.
And scientists came up with it, right? They developed it because it as a way of communicating. I think he'd have been very pleased.
Yeah, you're sharp enough to try and falsify your work with their ideas.
You could say that the transactions were the form of international communication in a very, very crude form of the web. They went out, started to go out everywhere, big hit in America and so on. So the idea of connectivity was there, and I think that was one of the things that established it. There's a lady about 5 rows back. There you are.
Yes. So when the Royal Society was formed, sort of amateur, sort of rich gentlemen who had lots of time on their hands were able to be scientists. These days you have to be very professional to be a scientist. Would you care to comment on that shift and the implications for the future of science?
Implication of the fact that these were rich men. Not all of them were. Never mind. Let's leave it at that. And how does that compare with today?
Well,
Joe?
Rob, can I have...
You have a go. No,
Yeah.
first go. Yeah.
I was only going to say, actually, Robert Hooke, they argue, was the first professional scientist because as curator of experiments, he was paid. I mean, I sometimes think you have the artisan there demonstrating to the gentlemen who, of course, were around him. Science has been professionalized, particularly since the sort of mid to late 19th century. And that has had an impact, I mean, on how we operate. But we're still driven by the same basic drive, I would say, curiosity and wanting to know.
No, yeah. So I guess I have two. So one, I think, is if you want to be a scientist, you can be a scientist. right? And you don't have to be a rich man to be a scientist. You have to study and you have to pursue a course of becoming a scientist, but everyone can do that. But also, it's part of the job of the scientists who are the professionals to share our ideas with the public and to include the public where we can. And we know that there are great ways in which the public can take part in scientific experiments, and we should encourage that.
In fact, it's quite a good way to be a poor man to be a scientist, in fact.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, we've got one right at the top of that.
Hi. We've had the Industrial Revolution, the Science Revolution recently. Is science, the scientific method and the process going to change much in the future, or are we there?
Would you like to comment on that? Start with you, Marcus. Is the scientific method going to change much in the future, or are we there?
Well, I certainly think the scientific method is pretty robust, and I think it's been in place for 400 years, so I can't really see what I would replace it with. But I think there are new things which come along. I mean, the development of the computer is having an effect on my own area of research. I mean, the fact that there are now computer proofs, so somehow the computer knows how to prove this thing, and we sort of let it run along, and it comes out with the solution that, say, for example, we can color a map with 4 colors, and you don't need any more than that. But there's a kind of question, I think, amongst the mathematical community about whether that's truly understanding, or whether the computer we know is going through a finite process, is probably more accurate than a human in going through that, but is that genuinely understanding? So I think there's a kind of shift happening in my own area because of, say, the power that we now have at our hands because of computer technology.
There's a question there, and then a question there. There's a question there first, at the back there. You're waving your hand, yeah.
What do you think our generation has to offer to the world of science?
Can't hear you, sorry.
What do you think our generation has to offer to the world of modern science?
It's the microphone's fault,
No,
not yours.
it's what is the current generation? There are a lot of students here, so what are they going to be offering for science? Well, certainly for me, you're going to be the ones who are going to answer the problems that I can't solve. I mean, I'm working on problems which I have no idea, and I'm relying on you lot to be able to tell me what the answers are. So, and I think it is about, it's really the exciting thing about doing science, which I think you summed up, is that baton passing. That the things that we can't do, we pass on, and every new generation comes up with a new story.
That's right. We need you, right? And we want you to do what inspires you, but we also know that there are really big problems that we want to solve, things connected to energy, diseases, and how we live. But also we want you to be able to learn about the world and be inspired by that. So please do it.
There's somebody up there, right? With a microphone?
It's up there.
Up there. Hello? You have a mic?
No, we don't have a mic, but we've got a...
You've got a strong voice, good, right. Would you like to repeat that question and answer it?
No, I couldn't hear it. Can you repeat it, and I'll then try and answer it?
Artificial intelligence is a part of our lives. Could we create artificial imagination? Is that what you said? And that could solve many problems in our life. Is that it?
Yeah, so if we can create so much that we have now, surely in the future we should be able to create artificial intelligence that can imagine and create.
That's a huge one. Right. Is there any possibility of creating an artificial intelligence that can create an imagination? Marcus?
Well, I made a program for Horizon about artificial intelligence, celebrating Turing's anniversary. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is about creativity and imagination. The current state of artificial intelligence, I think Turing would be very disappointed at how far we've got. I mean, it's actually, we've got a long way to go before we get anything which can do what our brains can. What is probably true is that we'll get a different sort of intelligence out of the artificial things that we're creating. And I saw some very exciting experiments where there was one experiment which didn't feature in the film, but they'd taken a jazz musician and understood the kind of riffs that he did on his saxophone, and they'd managed to make an algorithm which understood that sort of behavior. And then this computer was able to jam live time with other musicians, sort of passed a kind of musical Turing test. The other musicians did not realize that this was a computer-generated music coming out of this jazz artificial intelligence. And in fact, the saxophonist listening to it realized new things that he could do with his whole kind of world of riffs and things that the computer helped him to access.
Up there.
Today's talks seem to place a lot of emphasis not only on gathering empirical evidence, but on weighted criticism. Given this, why do you think there isn't such a prevalence on theories such as falsificationism within science, and why hasn't this seemed to have caught on?
Would you take that on, Joe, and repeat the question, please?
So you're saying we need evidence, empirical evidence to trust something, and you're saying why don't we put more weight into falsifications? Is that the question?
I'm saying that if, as you've put such concentration on weighted criticism, why isn't there such an emphasis on falsification?
Well, I mean, I think people do try and falsify experiments. I think it depends on the scientific area, actually. I think, so for example, in my area, that we only have one universe, right, to look at. So people can easily go and say whether someone else's observations were wrong, because it's not an experiment you get to repeat. So actually falsification plays an important role in that area. I'm aware that there are other areas of science where people don't actually repeat all the experiments, you know, things where you're maybe experimenting, trying to learn something about the brain and neuroscience. In that respect, yes, you need to be able to, I think that the idea of actually being able to repeat experiments and say, was that right or not, I think is incredibly important. And I'm not sure if it happens in all areas of science.
I think there's two aspects to talking about falsification. The first is, of course, falsification is a very important principle in science, because Karl Popper would argue that it is only the ability to produce theories that can be falsified that actually is important in distinguishing science from other activities. So that's the first point. Falsification is really crucial. The second is it does vary, as Joe quite rightly says, in different scientific disciplines. If you're working in biology, often the material is really quite fluid and difficult to fully reproduce, and there will be mistakes made. They're not being falsified, it's just simply there will be mistakes. And one of the great issues that has to be communicated to the public is that science very often early on in a study is tentative. And that's okay, because it's only through repeated testing and experiment it becomes more secure. But there is no shame in getting something wrong if you've had a good shot at it. And we've just had a Japanese stem cell biologist, a great one, commit suicide because of the shame associated with a potential mistake. And this is so terrible for science, because if you cannot be wrong, then you are just going to be so timid you will do nothing at all.
Now the questions are coming in, and there's 5 here, and I'm going to enumerate them so we can get all these 5. If you go first, and then you go second, and you go third, and then you go fourth, and I think I've run out. No, you go
There's
fifth.
one up
Right.
here.
Right, you go first now.
One observation I would suggest, and particularly following from Sir Paul's comment about the take-up in the 17th century, is the sheer volume of new knowledge hitting Europe at this time. Mathematical instruments in the Middle Ages have been astrolabes, weighing instruments, things of this sort. What happens by this time are instruments of what you might call quantitative and qualitative kind. Geographical discoveries. How do you make sense of what a shipwright discovers? How do you make sense of what you see through the microscope, through the telescope? Discover with the air pump, with the barometer, with geomagnetism. This sheer flood tide of new data forces on Europe especially. How do you make sense of this? And asking the question too, as Robert Hooke points out, Why was it never known to previous ages? Hooke says in Micrographia, why is it since the ages from the creation to us that none of this was known? And it was because, as Hooke says, instruments were artificial organs that strengthen the natural. And they go from Gilbert's original experiments on magnets to modern cosmology, right into body imaging machines in our hospitals and so on. And it's instrumentation.
The basis of that is that the thing that was a big push forward was instrumentation in the middle of the 17th century, which came in with a great force and extended, as it still does, and amplified the human mind and enabled it to move forward faster and deeper on many fronts. I think that was the gist of it, wasn't it? Right, Paul, what would your reaction to that?
What I would say, I think this is an issue that we are flooded with data. And I think we have to have a culture where mere description is not sufficient. And you have to move to understanding. And if that understanding sometimes is wrong, as I was emphasizing before, then it still could lead to faster progress. Because it is this reluctance to try and generalize and have ideas and just revert back to the data and the description, which in some ways delays progress. Because having a clear idea which you prove to be wrong can be much more effective than just having vague generalizations which are neither wrong nor right. I mean, they just lay out there. So I think it is something we have to think very carefully, because as Melvin said, that we're overwhelmed with data.
Question there.
Yeah, hello. What do you think the original founders of the Society would have made of the commercialization of science that we see today, particularly the patenting of scientific and natural knowledge?
What would the original founders of the Society have thought of the commercialization of science today, particularly the patenting system? Marcus, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think I would actually, it sort of just raises a point that I wanted to question with Paul in a way, because, you know, I think that one of the tragedies of our kind of community at the moment is this absolute necessity to look at the role of impact and the fact that we should be thinking about how our science is useful for society. Actually, I don't think that's the motivation of many people, and I think it really was summed up by Joe, that, you know, we do it because we love it. We love discovering new things, and we're still children at heart. And I think that's the drive. The exciting thing is, of course, all of this generally does give rise to exciting new technologies, but that should never be the end game, I think, of a scientist's investigations. The discoveries that we've made in my area, in symmetry, we've just discovered wonderful things in sort of high-dimensional space that were just there, and we wanted to discover them because we wanted to know. And they turned out to be the things which were absolutely essential in making the error-correcting codes that sent back the images that you use across the solar system. But that wasn't our motivation, the actual impact on society. And I think we have to be very careful. It is important, but of course, I think that at the moment, there's too much of a drive, which perhaps wasn't there in the Royal Society's founding time, to think always about, oh, how is this going to be useful? Because that just restricts creativity.
But nonetheless, I think we're all thrilled when something we do does then turn out to be incredibly useful for something that we never thought of. You know, that's.
I still get my thrill just from. Yes, my primary thrill is discovering new knowledge.
I agree.
Society does want science to produce things that improve their condition. But what is the real mistake is top-down direction of what science should be done, because it nearly always doesn't work. And there is a great emphasis on translation of science, but usually it is very ineffective. The key to this is to encourage the best science with the best people through curiosity and capture the discoveries very effectively. It's a very simple message, and actually the politicians will get it. The people who sell us short are often our own leaders who don't really get how science is properly done. I'm talking about our own scientific leaders.
Yeah.
Well, the finishing tape is approaching fast. Now, can we go over there? Yes.
Professor Dunkley, early on you spoke about how Halley, he wouldn't have found out the actual size of the solar system in his lifetime. And so he understood that he wouldn't find that out. Is there anything that you know or you think that won't be found out or discovered, any new sort of ideas or concepts that you're working on at the moment, like dark matter, that you don't think will be discovered, that you really, really want to find out in your lifetime?
I think even though I say to people, here are the things I want to learn in my lifetime, I think we might figure out dark matter. I think what we might not figure out by the time I die is dark energy. I hope we do, but I'm actually, we may not. This is something that this takes up actually 3/4 of our universe. It appears to be making space expand faster and faster, and we really have no idea what it is. Dark matter, we have some ideas. Dark energy, mysterious. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's still a question when I'm, 95.
There's a lot of evidence of scientists living to a long age, and I think it's partly because we want to be around to know, is the Riemann hypothesis true? What is dark energy?
Over there, question over there.
Hi.
Can't quite hear. Can you put it near your... Switching it on.
Hi there. I was wondering if modern day politics today plays a big role in science, and does it affect what scientists can do today compared to 400 years ago? And are we more free today to discover things in science compared to 400 years ago?
That's a very good question. Are politics more interfering now, we can put it that way, than they were 400 years ago? Paul?
Well, I have to work a lot with the politicians. On the whole, I think if you invest the time in explaining how it really works, they will listen to you. I mean, I'm not just here to knock the politicians, because I think they do. I think it's when we are lazy in our talking to them that there's a problem. I think that actually there was always a relationship between science and the politicians. The very first book that the Royal Society published was a book about naval timber, because they were very concerned, the government, about having wood for warships. And so there's always been that connection. It became more extreme after the Second World War because of the perceived role of science in winning that war. And Churchill famously said, what did he say? Science should be on tap, but not on top. So there are some politicians who obviously have it clearly down there. I sometimes think it should be science on top, not simply on tap.
Two last brief questions. One there first, and then one over there.
Hello. You explained before how John Wilkins' greatest achievement was bringing science to the people. However, in the modern age, most of society still believes in pseudoscience and something that might appear as science to them, like homeopathy, but doesn't really have much scientific background. Do you believe this sort of this trend is an obstacle to scientific progress and doesn't benefit the society?
Marcus, do you want to take that on?
Well, I think that's absolutely the reason why scientists need to step up to the plate and not just rely on somebody else doing it for us. We need, as soon as you start having a debate with people and explain the evidence, and it's often just that they haven't heard these stories, and it's up to us to tell these stories. So I think we've got a long way to go, and I think that your examples illustrate that. But I find that whenever you do have dialogue, you start to reveal these kind of false beliefs.
Last question there. You had your hand up, so I'm hoping for the best.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay.
I can hear you saying, is it on?
Yeah, okay, good. In your personal opinions, which science fields do you think will become biggest in the present or the near future?
Which science?
Fields.
With fields.
Oh, that's a very good ending. Which science field will become most important in the future? We'll start with you, work along the row. Marcus.
My belief that the evidence is that we should stop talking about scientific fields in isolation, because the real great progress is about everyone talking to each other, something which happens here in Oxford, especially because of the kind of collegiate atmosphere where you spend your time talking to not just scientists but people in the humanities too. So I think the great progress is going to happen on all of these connections between subjects, mathematics and biology, physics and the mind. So the exciting thing is not which field, but the connections between all of these fields is going to be where the new progress will happen.
Jo, you're a doctor?
That's right. So for example, the connection, I think the connection of in physics, the connection of biology and physics, people are getting really excited about that coming together. And I think people will always want to do fundamental physics, or fundamental science, I'm sorry, but there are other things people are getting excited about working on energy technology as a really practical implementation, practical application. So I think there's the kind of real life things that we're going to drive people, and then there's always going to be the fundamental science that's going to keep people going.
Paul, finally?
The great thing about science is you never know where it's going to go. And it could be any field next year, and I'm not brave enough to predict because I'd get it wrong. I'd get it wrong. And one thing about asking, well, in this case, your elders about advice for the future, I always remember what Max Perutz said when he, at some graduation ceremony, he was asked to give advice, and he went through all a list of things, including what areas one should look at for the future. And then the last thing he said is, and the most important piece of advice is never listen to advice of your elders.
Well, thanks to all the three speakers before I call on the Vice-Chancellor. Thank you all very much indeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, it falls upon me to bring the events of the evening to a close, and I think you will all agree with me. It's been a wonderful evening of conversation, of discussion, of celebration of science, of celebration of the invention of modern science, and particularly the role of John Wilkins in that invention. To celebrate his 400th birthday, but also that great time that we've heard our speakers discussing, that great time in the 1660s, when here at Wadham College, here in Oxford, science really began on that journey that has led to our modern position in this world of magnificent science that we've heard about. It's especially fitting that we've had tonight's event in this great building, the Sheldonian Theatre, because as we celebrate the 400th birthday in 2014 of John Wilkins, it is also this year that we are celebrating the laying of the foundation stone of the Sheldonian Theatre in 1664. So 350 years ago, this great building was built. And it does reflect, as we heard from the warden at the beginning, very much that sense that all of Oxford was engaged in this great adventure of the development of science. This building built by Christopher Wren, a cathedral to mathematics in its design. And all of you look up at the ceiling painting. This magnificent work is by a painter called Robert Streeter. He was the court painter of King Charles II, and it depicts the arts and sciences descending upon the university to banish ignorance. A magnificent sentiment, I think you'll agree. It was a sentiment like so much at that time that was ahead of its time. And all of you, just look hard at that painting, and if you can, just cast your eyes to the panel 2 over from this right-hand side, the panel 2 over, that gentleman leaning back. Look hard, look hard. I think you will agree with me that I am convinced he's holding an iPad.
But he's dropped it.
It clearly shows you that then, as now, Oxford was far ahead of its time. And we've had an example this evening with the contributions from 4 of Oxford's finest. We will claim Sir Paul Nurse as one of Oxford's finest because he did his greatest work here in Oxford. And on behalf of all of you, I want to thank our participants this evening. I want to thank Marcus de Sotoy, Joanna Dunkley, Sir Paul Nurse, and especially the moderator this evening, Melvyn Bragg. I also want to thank all of you for participating in this event, particularly the young future scientists. So many of you asked questions. That was a very important part of this evening's activities. Thank you all for participating. And ladies and gentlemen, would you join me in thanking our panel?
I think books by Ian Stewart definitely very good. So I recommend those.
We have, yes.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so you think you might study it at university? Brilliant. Come and do maths here. Yeah, solve the problem in this course.